Angel Reese said she was the Michael Jordan of the WNBA, and the league didn't just react. It snapped to attention like somebody pulled a fire alarm in a quiet building. Because in sports, you can call yourself a lot of things, and people will let it slide. A star, a dog, a problem, a future legend. But the second you bring up Jordan, you're not just talking confidence anymore. You're inviting a scoreboard conversation. And that's the part most people miss. The internet doesn't hear a Jordan comparison as motivation. It hears it as a challenge. It hears, judge me like the greatest. It hears, measure me like the standard. So the second those words leave your mouth, every clip gets sharper, every box score gets louder, and every miss starts feeling like it has a caption attached to it. Now, here's where this story gets messy in the most entertaining way possible. The moment that truly flipped it from talk into headline didn't happen on some debate show where people are paid to argue. It didn't happen on a highlight reel. It didn't even happen in a post-game scrum where someone can shrug and say, I was emotional. It happened in the one place that's supposed to feel safe, Angel Reese's own podcast. Her own mic, her own space. And sitting across from her wasn't some random hot take merchant looking for clicks. It wasn't a hater. It wasn't a troll with an agenda. It was Lisa Leslie, a real blueprint. A name that doesn't need volume to be respected. A legend who knows exactly what the job is supposed to look like when you're built to live around the rim. So imagine how that lands. You've got a young star building a brand, building an identity, building a voice. You're trying to expand beyond the court, because the truth is, women's basketball is finally getting the attention it's deserved for years. And anybody with common sense understands you'd be crazy not to take advantage of the moment. You're building a following, a platform, a presence. You're not just playing games. You're shaping your future. But while you're doing that, another force is happening in real time. Caitlin Clark is pulling the kind of numbers that turn casual sports fans into regular viewers and turn regular viewers into a market. The league signs a huge long-term media package beginning in 2026, and the reported value being discussed publicly is around $2.2 billion over 11 years. Which is the kind of number that changes how people talk about the entire sport. And that's the tension the whole internet has been circling like a storm cloud. Not who's more famous. Not who has more fans. Not who talks more. The real tension is who's actually moving the needle and who's just making noise. Because in the modern WNBA spotlight, you can be a great player and still get dragged if the wrong part of your game becomes a meme. You can be a dominant rebounder and still have the conversation twisted into, yeah, but can she finish? You can be building something real and still get treated like you're all hype if the clips don't match the confidence. And the craziest part is, Angel didn't even walk into that episode thinking she was about to get pressed. She didn't bring Lisa Leslie on expecting a public diagnosis. Most people invite legends on their show for praise, stories, and that nice, clean validation that turns into shareable clips. That's how these things usually go. But what happened instead was way more brutal. And way more valuable. Because Lisa Leslie didn't do the usual polite thing. She didn't sugarcoat. She didn't hide behind vague compliments. She looked Angel Reese in the face and went straight for the one thing the internet was already whispering about. And that's when the story stopped being funny. Because when a legend says it out loud on your platform, it's not just a joke anymore. It's a label. And once that label sticks, everything you say next gets filtered through it. But to understand why that moment hit like a slap across the timeline, you have to go back to the very first spark, the quote that turned regular criticism into a full-on obsession. Because the Jordan comparison wasn't just confidence, it was fuel. And the second it hit the air, people started digging for reasons to either crown her or clown her. And what they found next is exactly why this story got so loud. Because it wasn't just what she said, it was what her game looked like when people went looking. And once that happened, the internet didn't let go. But that wasn't the whole story, because the quote didn't just create pressure, it created a trap. The Jordan line is one of those things that sounds powerful in your own head, right up until you remember the world is listening. Because Michael Jordan isn't a nickname. It's not a vibe. It's not a mood. It's a resume. It's a myth built out of cold numbers and painful moments and a reputation that survived every era of scrutiny. People don't hear Jordan and think confidence. They think results. They think you better be able to back this up when it matters. So when Angel Reese put her name in that sentence, it didn't land like a normal self-hype moment. It landed like she walked into a room full of strangers and said, "Treat me like the standard." And here's what makes Angel's situation different from the way the internet tries to frame it. She's not some nobody chasing attention. She's been a spotlight figure for years. She's been polarizing since college. She's built a brand that people can't stop talking about, whether they love her or can't stand her. She's the type of athlete who doesn't just play, she performs. She understands cameras. She understands narrative. She understands how to turn a season into a conversation. And in today's sports world, that's not extra. That's survival. Because let's keep it real. Women's basketball players don't get paid like the men. The on-court only approach might sound noble, but it's also how you end up with a short career and long regrets. Angel Reese is one of the first new wave stars who's been completely open about the fact that the game is bigger than the game. She's building beyond the court. She's trying to be bigger than the box score. And whether people admit it or not, that mentality is part of why the WNBA is growing so fast right now. But the problem is, the internet doesn't reward nuance. The internet rewards contrast. And there is no contrast sharper than, "I'm the Michael Jordan of this league," paired with, "Wait, what do the numbers say?" Because the moment you trigger that curiosity, people don't search for your best games first. They search for your worst clips first. They look for the miss that makes the quote look ridiculous. They look for the moment that lets them feel like they caught you. They look for the evidence that your confidence is actually delusion. And that's what turned this into a whole thing. Not Angel's ambition. Not even the quote by itself. It was what happened after the quote left the room. Because once you say Jordan, you don't get graded like a promising young star anymore. You get graded like a finished product. You get graded like an icon. You get graded like you're already at the top. And in sports, that's a dangerous game. Angel Reese didn't just give people a headline, she gave them a measuring stick. And the second a measuring stick appears, the loudest voices rush in to decide where you fall on it. And here's where the story starts to split into two different realities. In one reality, Angel Reese is a young star who already does multiple elite things. The kind of player who can dominate a possession without scoring, who can flip momentum with hustle, who can turn missed shots into second chances, who can live on the glass like it's her property. In that reality, she's exactly what the WNBA needs. Personality, competitiveness, edge, a star that makes people feel something. But in the other reality, the one the internet prefers because it's cleaner and meaner, Angel Reese becomes a single storyline. The layups. That's the trap. Because when you've got a loud brand, people don't want your full game. They want a simple label they can repeat. Something catchy. Something they can turn into a meme. Something they can spam in comments without thinking. And once the Jordan quote spread, the label wrote itself. People went straight to the most brutal part of her offensive profile, efficiency. She shot 39.1% from the field as a rookie, a number that got repeated everywhere because it's easy to understand and easy to weaponize. Now, that number by itself doesn't tell the whole story. It never does. Shot selection, role, defensive attention, and the fact that rookies often have messy efficiency while they adjust, all of that matters. But again, nuance doesn't trend. Contrast trends. So the discourse became simple. Jordan is the greatest finisher and shot maker in history, and Angel Reese's field goal percentage is sitting at a number people associate with struggle. And once that comparison is in the air, everything gets uglier. Because the next step isn't analysis, it's humiliation. The next step is, let's clip every miss. The next step is, let's laugh at the rim outs. The next step is, let's turn it into a running joke. And from there, the storyline grows legs. It's not even about whether Angel can score anymore. It's about whether Angel can score the easy ones. The ones fans believe should be automatic if you're going to say the word Jordan with a straight face. That's why the quote mattered so much. If she had compared herself to a player known for rebounding, defense, hustle, and chaos, people might have argued, but the argument would have stayed softer. But Jordan is the ultimate symbol of inevitability. Jordan is the symbol of you can't stop it. So when Angel Reese said it, people didn't just hear confidence. They heard inevitability. And then they went looking for proof. And when the proof didn't look clean, when the misses looked loud, the internet did what it always does. It turned a complicated athlete into a simple joke. And here's the part that makes the whole thing even more intense. Angel Reese wasn't talking from some quiet corner. She was talking as a player with real momentum. She wasn't invisible. She was already in the conversation. She was already a star. So when she said Jordan, it wasn't a harmless statement. It was a power move. And power moves get tested. Immediately. Violently. Publicly. And that's when this stopped being about one quote and became about something deeper. The difference between claiming greatness and carrying greatness. Because claiming it is easy. Carrying it is brutal. Carrying it means your worst nights become everyone's favorite content. Carrying it means your off nights become your identity. Carrying it means every microphone becomes a courtroom. And the second Angel Reese said Jordan, she walked into that courtroom voluntarily. But here's the twist. Even that still wasn't what made this story explode. The quote created the pressure. The memes created the noise. The criticism created the heat. But the moment that truly changed the temperature was when someone with undeniable authority, someone who doesn't need to prove anything, sat across from Angel Reese and basically confirmed what the internet was already screaming. Because once Lisa Leslie says the words out loud, it's no longer fans being messy. It's no longer haters exaggerating. It becomes official. And when it becomes official, it changes what the quote means. It turns, "I'm the Michael Jordan of the WNBA," from bold confidence into a statement that invites one brutal response. Okay, then why is this still a problem? And that's why what happened next felt so cold. Because Lisa Leslie didn't come in to argue about Angel's personality. She didn't come in to debate her popularity. She didn't come in to attack her brand. She went straight to the simplest, most painful part of the conversation, the part that's hardest to dodge. And she said her biggest advice was about layups, flat out, directly, and she said it on Angel's own show. That's not a tweet. That's not a reaction clip. That's not somebody taking a cheap shot from the sidelines. That's a legend looking you in your eyes and saying, "This is what we're fixing." And when a legend says fixing, that word carries weight. Because fixing means it's broken. And broken is the last word you want attached to your name right after you put yourself next to Jordan. So by the end of Section 1, the stage is set. Angel Reese has ambition loud enough to fill arenas. The internet has a storyline sharp enough to cut her down. And Lisa Leslie is about to step into the middle of it and turn a viral joke into a serious conversation. Right on the record, right in front of everybody. And when that happens, it stops being about a quote. It becomes about a reckoning. And what happened next made the whole situation feel 10 times more personal. Because the correction didn't happen in public, it happened at home. The problem with viral sports narratives is that they rarely stay fair for long. Once a single weakness becomes entertaining to talk about, the internet doesn't just point it out, it builds an entire storyline around it. A missed shot turns into a clip. A clip turns into a compilation. A compilation turns into a meme. And before long, the conversation stops being about the player's full game and starts being about that one specific flaw. That's exactly what happened to Angel Reese. Because the moment people started focusing on the finishing struggles around the rim, the clips started spreading everywhere. Every missed layup. Every awkward bounce off the rim. Every sequence where the ball seemed to hang in the air just a little too long before dropping out. Those moments became the type of content the internet loves. Short, visual, easy to laugh at, and perfect for turning into running jokes. And the truth is, finishing around the rim is one of the most unforgiving parts of basketball when it comes to perception. A three-point miss doesn't feel embarrassing. Even great shooters miss most of their threes. But a layup? Fans assume those are automatic. They expect them to fall. When they don't, the miss looks louder than it actually is. So when the conversation started focusing on Reese's efficiency near the basket, it didn't take long for that single detail to overshadow everything else she was doing on the court. And that's the frustrating part for players in situations like this. Because Angel Reese wasn't invisible in the box score. Far from it. In fact, she was doing things that coaches obsess over. The dirty work that keeps possessions alive. She was crashing the glass, grabbing rebounds in traffic, fighting through contact, and playing with the kind of physical energy that often changes the entire rhythm of a game. Reese quickly built a reputation as one of the most relentless rebounders in the league, stacking double-digit boards night after night, and showing the type of motor that drives opponents crazy. But none of that makes a viral clip. Rebounding dominance doesn't travel across social media the way a missed layup does. Hustle plays rarely become memes. A player can control the glass for 40 minutes and still wake up the next morning to see the timeline talking about one missed shot instead. And that's exactly the trap Reese walked into. Because once the layup storyline caught fire, every broadcast started mentioning it. Analysts began discussing it. Commentators started referencing it during games. And fans who had barely watched her play before suddenly had a simple talking point they could repeat. Layups. It became the shorthand for everything. It didn't matter that Reese was doing multiple other things at a high level. It didn't matter that rookies almost always struggle with efficiency while adjusting to the speed and physicality of the professional game. None of that slowed the narrative down. Once the label stuck, the internet treated it like it was the only part of her game that mattered. And that's when the clips really started circulating. You could open any social platform and see slow-motion replays of misses at the rim, stitched together into compilations that racked up views faster than actual highlight reels. Some of them were exaggerated for comedy. Some were edited to emphasize the awkward angles. Some were just raw game footage replayed over and over with captions designed to provoke reactions. Within weeks, the layup storyline had become a full-blown online obsession. And the irony is that Reese herself wasn't hiding from the conversation. She wasn't ducking interviews or pretending everything was perfect. If anything, she leaned into the spotlight the same way she always had. Reese continued appearing in media, continued speaking openly about her goals, and continued building her presence beyond the court with podcast appearances and social content. That approach is part of what made her so polarizing. Some fans loved it. They saw confidence, personality, and the type of charisma that can grow the sport. Others saw it differently. They believed the attention should follow production, not the other way around. And when those two perspectives collide, the debate gets loud. Because sports fans are brutally simple when it comes to one thing: performance. They don't mind personality. They don't mind trash talk. They don't mind swagger. In fact, most of the time they enjoy it. But they expect the performance to match the energy. And when they believe the balance is off, they react. So Reese's confidence, the same confidence that made her a star in college and helped build her brand, suddenly became the fuel for criticism. The louder the personality looked, the louder the scrutiny became. Every statement was examined. Every stat was posted. Every missed shot was replayed. And the layup storyline only grew stronger. But the situation became even more complicated because Reese wasn't the only player dominating the conversation around the WNBA. At the exact same time all of this was unfolding, Caitlin Clark was drawing a completely different type of attention. Clark's games were becoming television events. Arenas were filling up. Ratings were climbing. Casual fans who had never watched a WNBA game before were suddenly tuning in just to see what the hype was about. And that contrast, whether fair or not, started shaping the entire conversation around the league. One player was being discussed for what she was saying. The other was being discussed for what the numbers were doing. The comparison wasn't always direct, but it was impossible to ignore. Every time Reese's efficiency came up, someone would point to Clark's impact on viewership or ticket sales. Every time Clark's popularity was mentioned, someone would bring up Reese's personality and brand presence. It created a narrative battle that went far beyond basketball. Production versus persona. Numbers versus noise. And whether Reese liked it or not, the layup storyline became the center of that debate. But here's the thing people often forget when these narratives explode. Players inside the game see everything differently than fans online. The internet turns weaknesses into jokes. Veterans turn them into teaching moments. And that's where Lisa Leslie entered the picture. Because while social media was busy laughing at the misses and commentators were debating efficiency, Leslie saw something completely different. She saw a young big with elite rebounding instincts. She saw a player who was constantly in position near the rim. She saw someone getting to the right spots, but not finishing the way dominant post players are expected to finish. To Leslie, that wasn't a punchline. It was a fixable problem. And that difference in perspective is exactly why the next moment in this story mattered so much. Because when fans criticize a player, it can always be dismissed as noise. When commentators debate stats, players can brush it off as media talk. But when a Hall of Famer sits down across from you and calmly points out the same flaw everyone else has been joking about, the conversation suddenly changes. It stops feeling like trolling. It starts feeling like reality. And that's exactly what happened when Lisa Leslie walked into Angel Reese's podcast studio. Because Reese might have expected encouragement. She might have expected stories from a legend. She might have expected the kind of praise most young stars hear when they interview someone from the previous generation. What she probably didn't expect was for the first major piece of advice from one of the greatest post players in history to be about the exact thing the internet had been laughing at for weeks. And when Leslie finally said it out loud, calmly and directly, the moment hit harder than any meme ever could. Because suddenly the viral jokes had a Hall of Fame voice behind them. And that's when the story stopped being internet entertainment and turned into something much more serious. The most uncomfortable truth in sports is that criticism hits different depending on who says it. Fans yelling on social media? Easy to ignore. Random commentators arguing on TV? Players shrug that off all the time. But when someone who actually dominated your position for a decade calmly points out a flaw, suddenly it's not just noise anymore. And that's exactly what made the Lisa Leslie moment so powerful. Because Lisa Leslie isn't just another former player with an opinion. She's one of the architects of the WNBA's early dominance. A Hall of Famer. A champion. A player who spent years living in the exact same area of the floor Angel Reese operates in, battling for rebounds, finishing through contact, controlling the paint. So when Leslie talks about what a dominant big should look like around the rim, she's not theorizing. She's remembering. She's speaking from experience that very few people in the sport can match. And when she appeared on Angel Reese's podcast, the expectation was probably pretty simple. Fans assumed it would be a conversation about the growth of the league, Reese's journey, maybe some stories from Leslie's playing days. That's usually how those interviews go, respectful, supportive, positive. Instead, the conversation went somewhere completely different. Because early in the discussion, Leslie looked directly at Reese and gave her the most honest advice she could give. Not about branding, not about media attention, not about popularity, about layups. She told Reese flat out that the biggest thing she wanted to work with her on was how she finished around the rim. The mechanics, the touch, the way the ball comes off the glass, the way a big player should be able to convert the easiest shot in basketball. And she didn't whisper it privately. She said it on air, right there in front of everyone listening. Now the tone wasn't cruel. It wasn't mocking. Leslie wasn't trying to embarrass Reese or tear her down. If anything, the moment sounded more like a veteran giving honest mentorship. She emphasized that the issue was fixable. She talked about the improvements Reese had already made in other areas, her defense, her ball handling, her energy. But the point was still clear. If Reese wanted to dominate the paint the way elite bigs do, finishing had to improve. And that moment mattered because it confirmed something people inside the game had been quietly thinking. Angel Reese was already doing many things at a high level. Her rebounding instincts were elite. Her motor was relentless. Her physicality made opponents uncomfortable. But the finishing piece, the ability to consistently convert close-range opportunities, was still a work in progress. And that's the kind of detail that separates good players from truly dominant ones. Because when a big player can both control the glass and finish efficiently at the rim, the entire offense opens up. Defenders have to collapse. Double teams arrive. Passing lanes appear. Suddenly the player becomes a gravitational force inside the paint. Lisa Leslie knew that. She had lived that role. So when she told Reese they needed to work on layups, she wasn't delivering an insult. She was describing the next step. But that's not how the internet heard it. The internet heard something much louder. The internet heard confirmation. Because for weeks fans had been joking about Reese's finishing struggles. Memes had spread everywhere. Clips had circulated. Comment sections had turned the issue into a running gag. And now a Hall of Famer had acknowledged the exact same problem. Suddenly the memes didn't feel like exaggeration anymore. They felt like evidence. That's why the moment exploded online. Not because Leslie was harsh, she wasn't. But because the setting made it impossible to ignore. This wasn't a criticism coming from across the league. It was coming from across the table. Angel Reese's own podcast. Angel Reese's own microphone. Angel Reese sitting right there hearing it in real time. And that made the moment strangely powerful. Because instead of reacting defensively or trying to dodge the conversation, Reese listened. She didn't shut it down. She didn't argue. She didn't pretend the problem didn't exist. The conversation kept moving, turning into something closer to a coaching session than a confrontation. Leslie talked about technique. She talked about repetition. She talked about the kind of daily work required to develop touch around the rim. Hundreds of shots, over and over again, practicing angles, soft finishes, quick releases. The type of grind every great big has gone through at some point in their career. And in that moment, the story shifted. For weeks the internet had treated Reese's finishing struggles as a punchline, but Leslie treated it like a project, a fixable flaw, a step in development. That difference in perspective revealed something important. Young players are rarely finished products. Even the most talented rookies arrive in the league with holes in their game. The transition from college to the professional level is brutal. Defenders are stronger. Rotations are faster. The margin for error is smaller. Players who dominated in college often spend their first few seasons adjusting. And Reese was no different. But the reason this moment carried so much weight is because of the broader conversation happening around the league at the same time. Because while Leslie was giving Reese honest advice about improving her finishing, another topic kept creeping into the discussion. Caitlin Clark. Clark's name had been appearing everywhere, in ratings reports, attendance records, sponsorship deals, television coverage. And during that same conversation, Lisa Leslie made it clear she had no problem acknowledging Clark's impact. In fact, she praised it. Leslie talked openly about how Clark had helped bring more eyes to the game. She emphasized that when one player brings attention and revenue into the league, every player benefits from that growth. When one player eats, we all eat. It was a simple phrase, but it carried a deeper meaning. Because Leslie wasn't framing the situation as a rivalry. She wasn't saying Reese had to compete with Clark for attention. She was explaining that Clark's popularity could actually help create more opportunities for everyone. More viewers, more sponsorships, more investment in the league, more money flowing into the system. And that perspective highlighted the real shift happening inside women's basketball. The sport was growing rapidly. Television networks were investing. New fans were arriving. A new generation of players, Reese, Clark, and many others, were stepping into the spotlight at exactly the right moment. But with that spotlight came pressure. Pressure to perform. Pressure to improve. Pressure to prove that the attention was deserved. And that's where the contrast between players started shaping the public narrative. Because while Reese was dealing with criticism about efficiency and finishing, Clark was becoming the center of a completely different type of conversation. One focused on ratings, ticket sales, television deals, and the kind of economic impact that makes executives pay attention. Which meant the story wasn't just about two players anymore. It was about the future of the league itself. One storyline revolved around development, a young star refining her game. The other revolved around momentum, a player whose presence seemed to be accelerating the entire business of women's basketball. And when those two narratives collided, the debate became impossible to avoid. Because the question people kept asking wasn't just about layups anymore. It was bigger than that. Much bigger. It was about who was truly moving the league forward, and who still had something to prove. And that debate only got louder when the numbers behind the WNBA's growth started coming out. Because once the financial side of the story became public, everything suddenly looked different. Right when the conversation around Angel Reese's development was heating up, something else was happening in the background that made the entire debate louder. The business side of the WNBA was exploding. For years, the league had been fighting the same uphill battle, trying to grow television audiences, trying to fill arenas consistently, trying to prove to sponsors and networks that women's basketball had a massive untapped market. The talent had always been there. The competition had always been there. But the attention didn't always match the level of play. Then something shifted, and the shift had a name. Caitlin Clark. Clark entered the WNBA with more hype than almost any player in league history. Her college career had already turned her into a national phenomenon. Fans who had never watched women's basketball before suddenly knew exactly who she was. Her games were breaking viewership records. Her logo range shooting was flooding social media. And by the time she entered the professional league, she wasn't just a rookie. She was already a brand. But the real surprise wasn't just the hype. It was the numbers. Indiana Fever games started drawing massive attention almost immediately. Arenas that used to have empty sections suddenly looked packed. Opposing teams began moving games to larger venues when Clark came to town because demand was so high. Ticket prices skyrocketed in certain cities. Merchandise sales surged. And television networks noticed. Because networks don't operate on feelings. They operate on viewership. When a broadcast pulls strong numbers, advertisers pay more. When advertisers pay more, the broadcast slot becomes more valuable. And when a sport suddenly proves it can deliver consistent audiences, the entire industry starts treating it differently. That's exactly what began happening with the WNBA. Clark's games were pulling viewers in huge numbers. Multiple broadcasts cleared the million-viewer mark across major networks. For a league that had struggled with national visibility in previous years, that kind of performance sent a very clear signal. There was a real market here. And when the market wakes up, the money follows. Around the same time this wave of attention was building, the WNBA finalized one of the most important business deals in its history, a massive long-term media rights agreement set to begin in the coming years. The reported value being discussed publicly hovered around $2.2 billion over 11 years, a number that completely changed the financial conversation surrounding the league. That wasn't pocket change. That was proof. Proof that the sport had reached a point where major networks believed it could consistently deliver audiences worth paying for. Disney, Amazon, NBC Universal, all major media players, were involved in the bidding process. That level of competition only happens when executives believe the content has serious long-term value. And suddenly the entire narrative around the WNBA changed. Instead of asking whether the league could survive, people were asking how big it could become. Expansion teams were being discussed. Arena capacities were increasing. New sponsorship deals were appearing. For the first time in a long time, the conversation wasn't about keeping the lights on. It was about growth. And in the middle of all of that growth, one player's name kept coming up. Caitlin Clark. Her games weren't just performing well, they were dominating the conversation. When she played, the attention followed. Sports shows talked about her highlights. Morning programs replayed her deep threes. Social media filled with clips of her passing vision and scoring bursts. And perhaps most importantly, casual fans, people who normally wouldn't follow the WNBA, were tuning in just to see what the hype was about. That kind of crossover appeal is rare in sports. It's the type of phenomenon that changes the economics of an entire league. Because when a single player can attract millions of viewers who were previously uninterested, the product suddenly becomes much easier to sell. That's why Lisa Leslie's comment about Clark mattered so much. She didn't dodge the subject. She didn't minimize it. She openly acknowledged the impact Clark was having. Leslie explained that Clark was helping bring attention to the sport, and that attention was benefiting everyone in the league. More viewers meant bigger deals. Bigger deals meant more revenue. More revenue meant higher salaries and better opportunities for players across the board. When one player eats, we all eat. It wasn't just a catchy phrase. It was an economic reality. Because when Clark's games drew massive audiences, networks paid attention. When networks paid attention, they invested more money into broadcasting the league. And when that money flowed into the system, it created opportunities for every player wearing a WNBA jersey. But that reality also created tension. Because the sudden explosion of attention around one player raised uncomfortable questions for others. Was the league leaning too heavily on Clark's popularity? Were veteran stars being overlooked? Was the coverage balanced? Those debates started appearing everywhere, on sports talk shows, on podcasts, across social media. Some players expressed frustration that Clark seemed to dominate the spotlight. Others embraced the idea that her popularity could accelerate the league's growth. And somewhere in the middle of that debate sat Angel Reese. Because Reese had her own massive following. She had built a powerful personal brand. She had become one of the most recognizable faces in women's basketball. But the narrative surrounding her looked completely different from the one surrounding Clark. Clark was being discussed as an engine for the league's economic boom. Reese was being discussed for her personality, her confidence, and the flaws in her offensive efficiency. And whether that contrast was fair or not, it shaped the public conversation. Every time Clark's ratings numbers were mentioned, someone brought up Reese's viral layup clips. Every time Reese's popularity was highlighted, someone compared it to Clark's statistical production. The debate became unavoidable. Not because the two players were directly competing with each other every night, but because they represented two very different storylines unfolding at the same time. One storyline was about market impact. The other was about development and controversy. And when those narratives collided, fans started framing the entire discussion in simple terms. Production versus persona. Numbers versus noise. Who was truly changing the league, and who still had something to prove. But the truth is, the story wasn't that simple. Because Angel Reese wasn't just a controversial personality. she was also building something of her own. Her brand partnerships were growing. Her social media presence was enormous. Her podcast platform was attracting major guests. Companies were betting on her long-term star power the same way sponsors were betting on Clark's on-court production. And that's when the conversation shifted again. Because once endorsements and sponsorships entered the picture, the debate stopped being purely about basketball. It became about business, brand power, marketability, and the very different ways players can build influence in modern sports. One path is built on statistical dominance. The other is built on personality and visibility. And the WNBA suddenly had stars representing both, which meant the question people kept asking grew even bigger. It wasn't just who's the better player. It was something much more complicated. Which type of star actually moves the market? And that development was about to add another twist to the entire conversation. Because once the Fever started clicking as a team, the narrative shifted again. Suddenly it wasn't just about individual stars anymore. It was about winning. And winning has a way of silencing a lot of debates. But it can also make the contrast between teams and players even harder to ignore. Which is exactly what started happening when the Fever's roster began coming together. And when that happened, the gap between production and perception started looking even more obvious. There's one thing in sports that can flip a narrative faster than anything else. Winning. Fans can argue about personalities. They can debate stats, contracts, marketing, and media attention for hours. But when a team starts winning consistently, most of that noise fades into the background. And that's exactly what began happening in Indiana. For a while, critics had a simple complaint about the Fever. They argued that Caitlin Clark was carrying too much of the load. The idea was that the team relied heavily on her playmaking and scoring, and if she had an off night, the entire offense slowed down. At first, that criticism had some truth to it. Clark was a rookie stepping into a massive spotlight. She was adjusting to the pace of the professional game, while also handling the pressure of being the most talked-about player in the league. Opposing teams built their entire defensive strategies around stopping her. Every arena she walked into was packed with fans, waiting to see what she would do next. That kind of attention is exhausting. But something interesting started happening as the season progressed. The pieces around Clark began developing. And when those pieces started clicking, the Fever suddenly looked like a completely different team. Lexi Hull, for example, quietly turned into one of the most important role players on the roster. She wasn't the type of player who demanded headlines or highlight reels every night, but she brought something every championship-level team needs: toughness and intelligence. Hull played defense with relentless energy, made smart cuts, and took advantage of the opportunities Clark created with her passing. Players like that don't always dominate the box score, but they change how the team functions. And Clark recognized it. She talked openly about making sure teammates like Hull were involved in the offense, celebrating their contributions, and helping build the kind of chemistry that can turn a good roster into a dangerous one. That chemistry matters more than people realize. Clark once described how team unity can swing games by 10 or even 12 points simply because players trust each other. When teammates know where the ball will be, when they know someone will make the extra pass, when they know everyone is pulling in the same direction, the entire game flows differently. Indiana started showing signs of that flow. And then there was Aaliyah Boston. Boston brought something to the Fever that every successful team eventually needs: a reliable interior presence. While Clark stretched defenses with her shooting and passing, Boston anchored the paint with strength and efficiency. She could finish around the rim, absorb contact, and force opposing defenses to respect the inside game. That balance made the Fever much harder to defend. If opponents focused entirely on stopping Clark's perimeter offense, Boston punished them inside. If they collapsed in the paint, Clark punished them from deep. And suddenly the Fever offense became a puzzle instead of a single piece. Kelsey Mitchell added another dimension to the attack. Her ability to create her own shot meant the Fever didn't have to rely exclusively on Clark for scoring bursts. Mitchell could break down defenders, hit difficult jumpers, and keep the offense alive during stretches when the game slowed down. Then there was Sophie Cunningham, whose physical style of play added an edge to the roster. Cunningham wasn't afraid of contact. She played with an intensity that made opponents uncomfortable, the kind of presence that changes the emotional temperature of a game. Put all those pieces together, and the Fever began looking less like a team carried by a rookie and more like a balanced roster with a clear identity. Clark was still the engine, but the engine finally had the parts around it. And when that happens, everything changes. Because winning games doesn't just boost standings. It reshapes narratives. For months, critics had questioned whether Clark's hype was sustainable. They wondered if the excitement around her would fade once defenses adjusted and the novelty wore off. Instead, the opposite seemed to happen. Clark kept evolving. She had entered the league with one of the best passing visions in basketball, men's or women's. But as the season progressed, she began layering more skills onto her game. Her scoring improved. Her decision-making sharpened. Her ability to read defenses became even more dangerous. Defenders couldn't simply trap her anymore. If they doubled, she found the open teammate. If they sagged off, she shot. If they pressured the perimeter, she attacked. And as her teammates grew more comfortable around her, the offense started flowing faster. That's the terrifying part for opposing teams. Because Clark wasn't a finished product yet. She was still improving. And when a player who already draws massive attention continues to develop new dimensions to their game, the ceiling starts looking extremely high. Meanwhile, the Fever's home games became some of the hottest tickets in the WNBA. The arenas were loud. Fans showed up early. Every possession felt like it carried the possibility of a highlight. Clark's deep three-pointers, no-look passes, and dramatic scoring runs became the type of moments that filled sports shows the next morning. Those moments weren't just entertaining. They were valuable. They were exactly the kind of content television networks wanted when negotiating massive broadcast deals. Because highlight plays drive viewership, and viewership drives revenue. The Fever had become appointment television. Fans didn't just watch the games if they happened to be on. They planned their evenings around them. And when a league reaches the point where casual fans are scheduling their time around games, that's when you know the product has reached another level. But while Indiana's momentum was building, the situation in Chicago looked very different. The Sky were dealing with instability. Roster changes. Questions about team direction. Reports of tension within the locker room began circulating in media coverage, suggesting that not everyone was on the same page about the team's future. Angel Reese found herself in the middle of that environment. She remained a central figure in the franchise, one of its most recognizable players and a major part of its long-term plans. But the combination of on-court criticism, media attention, and organizational uncertainty made the spotlight around her even brighter. Because when a team struggles while a player remains highly visible, the contrast becomes unavoidable. Fans begin asking questions. Is the player's brand overshadowing the team's performance? Is the criticism fair? Is the player being judged too harshly? Or not harshly enough? Those debates rarely have simple answers. But they do shape perception. And perception matters in sports almost as much as reality. Because once fans decide what story they believe about a player, that story becomes incredibly difficult to change. Angel Reese was still early in her career. She still had time to improve. She still had the physical tools and competitive fire that made her a star in the first place. But the narrative surrounding her had grown complicated. It wasn't just about rebounding. It wasn't just about scoring. It wasn't just about personality. It was about expectations. And expectations in modern sports are brutal. The moment you become a headline, every performance gets measured against the version of you people expect to see. And that brings the story back to the moment that started everything. The Michael Jordan comparison. Because the real reason that quote continues to echo isn't just because people want to mock it. It's because comparisons like that carry a challenge. A challenge to prove something. A challenge to show growth. A challenge to silence critics with performance. Angel Reese hasn't finished writing her story yet. But the next chapter will matter more than any headline or podcast quote ever could. Because in the end, the debate between production and persona only lasts until one thing happens. Results. And the moment those results change, the entire conversation changes with them. When you step back and look at the entire situation, the story isn't really about one quote or one missed shot. It's about two completely different paths colliding in the spotlight of a rapidly growing league. Angel Reese represents the new era of athletes who understand the power of personality. She knows how to command attention. She knows how to build a brand that extends far beyond the court. Her confidence, her voice, and her willingness to speak openly about the business side of sports make her one of the most visible figures in women's basketball. Caitlin Clark represents something else. The type of player whose impact shows up everywhere the numbers are counted: television ratings, ticket sales, sponsorship deals, and the overall economic momentum of the league. Both types of influence matter. Both help grow the sport. But the difference between them has created one of the most fascinating debates the WNBA has ever seen. Because fans keep asking the same question. Who's actually moving the needle? Is it the player whose presence brings millions of viewers to the screen? Or the player whose personality dominates the cultural conversation? Lisa Leslie's comments revealed something important about that debate. She didn't dismiss Angel Reese. She didn't attack her confidence. She simply pointed out the next step. The improvement that could turn Reese from a polarizing star into an unstoppable one. Fix the finishing. Master the easy points. Turn the one weakness everyone jokes about into another strength. Because if Reese does that, the entire narrative changes overnight. The memes disappear. The criticism fades. And the same confidence that people mocked suddenly starts looking prophetic. That's how sports works. Today's punchline can become tomorrow's redemption story. And in a league growing as fast as the WNBA, those redemption stories matter. Because the sport doesn't just need one star. It needs many. Clark's success brings new viewers. Reese's personality brings new conversations. Other players across the league bring talent, rivalries, and unforgettable moments that keep fans coming back. Together, they're building something bigger than any single storyline. The future of women's basketball. But the question that started this whole debate still lingers. The one fans argue about every time these names appear in the same sentence. Production, or persona, moving the needle, or making noise. And the truth is, the answer might not be decided by debates or headlines. It will be decided on the court, over time, one game at a time, one improvement at a time. Because the real legends of the sport don't just talk about greatness. They grow into it.